Okay, thank you very much, Alessio, for agreeing to present today on green industrial policy and energy transition. And thank you all for joining. Alessio is an economist working at the intersection of academia, think tank, and policy. And he's a lecturer on public policy at the University of Cambridge, an adjunct professor at economics at the Sciences Po University in Paris. And he has been over 5 years in the European Commission, where he has helped design overall economic strategies associated with the European Green Deal. And he will talk more about that. Please take it away.
Thanks a lot, Luis, for the invitation. I'm going to try and share the slides as we did before. Hoping it works. Can you see them all right? Good. So as I was telling Luis and Lauren, this is my first act coming back from holidays. So on the positive side, I'm fired up and ready to go, as Obama would say. At the same time, I need to get back into the business of industrial policy slowly but surely. I've put together some slides for this talk. I have been told I have roughly 40 minutes. Now, the slides are way too many for that, and I'm saying it up front. I'm saying it up front because I think it is, I'm just going to mention a few things on which what I'm going to talk about is based. And so if at some point you're interested in delving deeper, there's a book chapter I've written on industrial policy, and I'm going to talk about this. There is a previous paper that I've written, and I'm going to build partially, but not much on this today. There is a new working paper that came out just before the summer with the Bennett Institute at Cambridge on this topic. And of course, for the boldest of you, the ones that have more time, there is a book that I've written that it looks at the green transition, the green transformation, what it will mean for the economy. And of course, there's a focus on industrial policy. Now, I am going to go fast. I've been told that I need to manage, let's say, a presentation that is more policy-oriented and not necessarily only for an academic seminar or a bunch of economists. So I was going to start with a few definitions that I think is important to have in mind, or at least to make sure that we're talking about the same thing, because with industrial policy, even among economists, there is a bit of confusion. So it's worth spending a few minutes on this. Again, I'm going to go fast on the introductory slides, so don't fear not, but because I think that towards the end, there is more pith, there's more on the policy dimension, and I think this is something that you're more interested in. So this is only to say that when I talk about industrial policy, what I mean is that you're using government policy to reorient production towards some things, towards a specific sector. Now, there are two elements to that, and it is that first, production in certain sectors is more desirable than others if you want to reorient your productive capacity in a certain direction. And the governments should intervene to do something about that. So nudging the economy in that direction. Now, is it true that production is more desirable in certain sectors? You can make this argument along multiple lines. You can say that, you can go back to some early literature by Ricardo Hausmann, Danny Roderick, and others that were saying, we see that if you're specialized in certain goods, this contributes to you exporting more and growing more, and so that there are certain sectors that are better to focus on. If you look at the green transition, you can say, we want to shift the direction of our economy in certain sectors that are important for the green transition. You can bring in the geopolitical dimension and say, certain stuff is important from a military perspective. Dual-use technologies are important for the military, and therefore we want to make sure that we have a cutting-edge technology in, quantum computing, AI, space, things like this. So these are only some of the arguments you can use as to why certain sectors might be more desirable than others, or why you want to use policy to push in that direction. The point I make in the paper that I said I was not going to talk about, and this is the only reference I make to that paper, is to say we try to show in the paper that all countries engage in industrial policy and always have. And so it is a matter of degree rather than black or white, yes or no. So there are a variety of policy tools that multiple countries, including the US, have been using in the past to prod production in a certain direction. That being, and it's true for Europe, it's true for Japan, it's true for China, obviously, for a variety of countries. Those more for the UK, those more laissez-faire, and those more interventionist, all have been using industrial policy, just to different degrees. But what is true is that this tool is being used more, and this is something that, of course, Roderick, Lane, and Juhasz have shown in a recent paper. You can see it in Financial Times. I was borrowing or building on IMF data that shows that this is being used more. Now, why is it being used more? For a long time, this is perhaps more important for younger students and those that are entering the economics or economic policy profession more recently. And it might come as a surprise, but for a long time, the persuasion was that it didn't matter what you specialized in. And so we're living in, let's say, the golden era of the latest wave of globalization, early 2000s. This was an era where, if you have the idea was we focus on our comparative advantage, and if our comparative advantage is making yogurt, and your comparative advantage is making rockets, I will make yogurt, you will make rockets, and we will trade. And it doesn't matter what you are specializing in. And so if, for example, manufacturing is shifting to China, and this and away from Europe and away from the US, so be it. It means that we are letting comparative advantages, let's say, appear, and it means that we have a comparative advantage in services, and so we let them produce stuff and we do services, and that is fine, and we just trade. So this has come to an end. It has come to an end for a variety of reasons. Again, I'm going to go fast. There are papers that have been looking at this. One of the reasons is China, obviously. And it is the fact that China has been using it a lot, obviously, has a model, a growth model that was centered on industrial policy and state interventionism. And so first, it has been successful at it. It has grown immensely, even by historical standards. The degree of growth that China has managed to achieve is impressive. And what this means is that it weakened the argument that you shouldn't be doing this because this was a bad idea and so on. You have a very strong counterexample. Second, dynamically, the world of comparative advantages worked if everybody was sticking to it and not using industrial policy to try and make sure that it was strong in certain dimensions. And of course, China became more and more important. It wasn't a big economy at the beginning of the 2000s, but as it grew in size, the elephant in the room became more evident. Second is COVID. COVID was a classic or a prime example that production you want to have access to certain things, including personal protective equipment, vaccines, and so on. And we've had governments step in when needed to boost production of some of these things. Of course, this was related also to supply chains and global supply chains coming to a standstill during COVID. And so bringing that dimension into the picture of saying, okay, you cannot rely on trade and free trade working freely very well, because if something happens, you're not very resilient. And so you want to focus on this resilience dimension and not have all your eggs in one basket, have all of your manufacturing coming out of one country. This can be true for a variety of reasons. It can be a pandemic, but it can be also geopolitical dimensions. And so there is a return of geopolitics on number 4. And there is climate change, which is obviously a dimension that we are interested in, and I've been working on more. What I've been arguing for the green transition is that we need a strong green industrial policy to reach our climate goals, or to help us reach our climate goals, because the transformation we're trying to achieve is huge, because technology is important, innovation is important, but there is a degree of path dependency. And so if you let the private sector just do its thing, there is an inherent bias where you will continue innovating on what you do. And so you will have BMW or the big car producers trying to improve the efficiency of their own combustion engine, but it will be harder for them to shift completely to a new electric vehicle, an innovation in an electric vehicle dimension. This is something that we're seeing, by the way, now, and it's why some European car makers are struggling. There are, if we want to use more economicsy terms, there is a variety of market failures that industrial policy is trying to address. There is a degree of risk aversion, which to a degree is what I was hinting at also beforehand. There is the fact that the private sector, again, might be afraid of investing big on technologies that are very far from market, which incidentally is also why all countries and a variety of governments subsidize general research or basic research, is because this is research that probably wouldn't happen. It probably has very big, large positive externalities and has little scope for appropriation in the short term. And so this is something that the private sector will underinvest in. There are political economy reasons as well that have been brought up, which is to say, yes, it's true, from a perfect first best scenario, you could achieve decarbonization only with prices and with carbon prices. And so if you were to slap and increase prices on the emissions of CO2, you would achieve a full green transition and net zero eventually. But the problem from a political economy perspective is that achieving those high prices is extremely unpopular. And so that you can achieve them in a textbook scenario, but you cannot do it in practice. And so you need something to support that, and industrial policy can have that role. And by the way, the two things should be in dialogue. And so the fact that I am in favor, or I've been arguing in favor of industrial policy, doesn't mean that carbon prices don't matter, and vice versa. Even if you care or think that carbon prices are central, it doesn't mean that you should necessarily be against a green industrial policy. There is an argument that is also more, how should I put it, national in spirit, which is to say, look, the green technologies, the green transition will eventually happen. And if you are at the frontier of green technologies, you can first tilt innovation in the direction of your own comparative advantages, of what you are you're generating, producing. And crucially, if you develop an expertise in some of these industries, these are things that will matter for your growth for the long term. And so even for a government that is nationalistic at heart, not internationalistic, not globalist, or not interested in the wider future of the planet, but just trying to maximize the prosperity of their own country, it makes sense to try and be a leader rather than a follower in the technologies of the future, of which the green technologies are likely to be one. And this is something that I've been talking about. Now, the problem with this, so the chapeau is, I am all in favor of green industrial policy. I think it's useful. It can help us reach green transition targets and so on. So this is the positive narrative. And it is something that I think you've been exposed to, because the US has been using industrial policy at scale with the Inflation Reduction Act, obviously. And that is the reasoning behind it. Now, the problem with it, and here I'm borrowing from this, this quote by Larry Summers, is that there are some problems with green industrial policy that I don't think are discussed enough. And this is what I want to focus on. And to a certain extent, I've been talking of a Faustian pact or a pact with the devil when engaging in green industrial policy or industrial policy to achieve the green transition. And I will explain to you why. Now, again, definitions. This is not something I've invented. The industrial policy tools can be divided in offensive and defensive. Offensive, I didn't come up with this name, it is what it is, but it is things like R&D subsidies, tax credits, and so on. The defensive side is trade and investment restrictions or domestic requirements, say, for your industrial policy. Generally, economists, it's hard to generalize because obviously economists are a wide bunch with very different opinions, but I would say that the consensus is shifting in favor of using industrial policy with some caveats and targeting market imperfections and so on. But generally, the ones I talk to that say, you know, we're in favor of this, they are in favor of the offensive side. So they're all in favor of saying, okay, you know, use the R&D subsidies, use the tax credits, but don't do trade restrictions, don't do investment restrictions, don't do national content requirements, and so on. Now, my argument is that this is a bit of a wishful thinking, and that if you use industrial policy, offensive industrial policy at scale, at a multi-billion-dollar scale, this will lay the seed from a political economy perspective. It will lay the ground for the defensive side. In a sense, or in rough terms, if we're spending billions, it's going to be hard to go to Congress, ask for this amount of money and say, well, but this might benefit Chinese companies, it might benefit other Indonesian companies and so on, and this is money that is flowing there. It's very hard from a political perspective, and that is why, you know, I don't blame it on some strange alignment of stars that this happened in the US and it shouldn't have happened. It happened because of political economic constraints. And indeed, we're seeing that protectionism is on the rise as industrial policy is on the rise. Now, there is a battle of what I've called the battle of the Martins, because of obviously on the Financial Times, there is Martin Wolf, but there is also Martin Sandbu, and they have been taking different positions as to whether the use of green industrial policy and the fact that there is a subsidy race at global level is a good thing or a bad thing. Of course, there is a positive argument to be made, which is also what I hear when I come to Washington, D.C., and I talk to people about the Inflation Reduction Act. And it is along the lines of, look, you've been wanting the US to do something about climate change for 20 years now. Now we have the Inflation Reduction Act. What do you want? We are spending big money on the green transition, on green subsidies. If this starts a subsidy war, it means that China is going to spend big on green subsidies and Europe is going to spend big on green subsidies. And so we're all spending a lot of money on the green transition, which is a good thing. We know that we need to invest big money on the green transition, on the climate fight. So there is this positive argument to be made, but there is a negative argument to be made as well, which is along the lines of what I was presenting, and I like to say you're breaking up world trade. And this has potential downsides. And the potential downsides come from the fact that, of course, you're generating a subsidy race, but the subsidy race is expensive. It requires a lot of billions of dollars that you have to be able to put on the table, and not all countries are able to put this amount of money on the table. In one of the papers I was writing, I was saying, you know, at a rough approximation, we're talking about maybe G20 countries, and not even all of them, not Argentina, not South Africa. But other countries, including emerging markets, including India, including Indonesia, they are in the position of putting big money on the table, and they are doing that in order to foster production of green transition, manufacturing and production. but this is expensive. And so, of course, the world, the globe is not composed only of 20 countries. There are many more. And what happens to the rest? And what happens to the rest is that they cannot put this amount of money on the table, and they are gonna be, they can do nothing. But of course, if they do nothing, they're gonna be flooded with manufacturing that has been subsidized and produced elsewhere, thanks to government money, thanks to subsidies. And so again, from a political economy perspective, what they're likely to do is increase trade barriers. So to raise tariffs along the lines of thinking of an infant industry protection, and of saying, okay, look, everybody's making electric vehicles, everybody's putting all this money to produce electric vehicles. I cannot put money in producing electric vehicles in Morocco, but I can raise trade barriers to make sure that at least I'm not flooded with those goods, and I can try to foster the development of this industry at home. Of course, this comes at risks, because you are reducing the possibilities for FDI, you're reducing the flow of knowledge, and you're spreading yourself thin in terms of production, and so on. And so it is not great, let's say, for emerging markets. I'm making here the argument also beyond, also related to the CHIPS Act and so on. And by the way, this is something we're seeing. The US went ahead with a CHIPS Act, and then the Koreans came and put billions on the table for fabs, and the Japanese did the same, and Europe is doing the same with its own CHIPS Act. And so we have this industrial policy that is being used by countries that can, but of course it cannot be done by other countries that are at risk of being squeezed. And so that you're using industrial policy to re-attract manufacturing of certain goods, and you're thinking, I'm doing this against China, but actually China is going to continue subsidizing its own production. It's a large market, and it will continue producing, and the only ones that will get squeezed between this great powers race is countries that cannot afford to enter this game, which is a poorer nation. I'm making the same point here, and this just to say that it matters for emerging markets, for developing countries, because developing countries need an open or a more free trade environment, because they need to export. And to make this argument, I could have used a variety of papers. I used this report by the World Bank that I think is interesting, because it uses case studies to a certain extent, and is looking at growth miracles with a variety of policymakers, Nobel Prize winners, economists, surveys, interviews, to try and understand what do growth miracles have in common since the 1950s to today, is covering a variety of countries, the Asian tigers, countries in Latin America, China, and others. What did they do that they have in common? They did a variety of different things, so that's interesting that there is no single silver bullet to generate growth, but they all had growing exports. They all relied on exports, and the reason why they all relied for exports is, first, by definition, if you're a poor country, if you're a developing nation, your domestic demand is small, and so you need a market that is large to grow fast, and having access to exports to the international dimension is important. Second, it allows you to loosen the current account constraint. This is a bit more technical on an international macro perspective, but effectively it means that if you export stuff, it allows you, without weakening your currency, to import the machinery you need to then move up the value chain. And so you need exports, and you need a world market in order to grow and to develop. And if our industrial policy, even if it's meant, in the best of fashion, and it is meant to help fight the climate fight or bring back manufacturing, because this is important from a political perspective and so on, you can make all the arguments you want that are on the good side. If you're breaking up the international trade, this will have detrimental effect, particularly on poorer nations. And what this means is that global income convergence will slow down and will come to a halt, and this is already something that we're seeing. This comes from a World Bank blog, but which builds on our recent World Bank paper. And again, I could have used a variety of papers. Stiglitz and Roderick were showing the same thing with different data, which is to say that global income convergence is slowing down and has probably come to a halt. And so, you know, you will still have the individual countries doing well. You can have India doing well, or you can have China doing well, other emerging nations doing well. But as an aggregate phenomenon, emerging markets are not doing well. And industrial policy and a further fragmentation of trade is not going to help out in this dimension. And this again is the Faustian Pact explained. What I was discussing. So I skip this. The irony of all of this is that for a long time, I told you industrial policy was a bit at the fringes of economic policy. It was considered something very hippie, very left-wing, and it was the left-wing economists and thinkers that were saying we have to use more industrial policy. It was the development folks that were saying we've got to use more industrial policy. And now that they're getting it, this is actually coming to the detriment of the global South. And so it is a bit of an irony or a paradox of this resurgence of industrial policy. There are other negative consequences. Now, one relates to prices. The easy way to make this argument is to say, look, we're seeing it now with China, in electric vehicles in China, in Europe. And it is to say, you know, we're using anti-subsidy provisions to increase tariff barriers on Chinese electric vehicles. And in parallel, we're trying to make sure that batteries and electric vehicles are produced in Europe. Right now, electric vehicles made in Europe are more expensive. And what this means is that we're using industrial policy, but in the process of using it, we're making green products more expensive for consumers. So we're increasing prices for consumers that could buy a cheap Chinese electric vehicle, and instead are having to buy a more expensive European equivalent due to tariffs. And so this, you know, slows down, is negative for the consumer, but it also, from a global perspective, this is bad, because if you were planning this from a global government perspective or a first best perspective, you would want to use the cheapest available technology, and if it happens to be made in China, you know, you use that, and you're lowering the costs of the green transition. You're allowing it for a green transition to happen quickly, faster, and you're using policy tools that are going to get in the way. And they're increasing prices. This is something we saw with the trade tariff, Trump tariff or trade barriers. You know, effectively, this is if we talk about gains from trade, going back to David Ricardo or Adam Smith, and this is losses from deglobalization. So it's exactly the opposite of focusing on your comparative advantage and trading. Here, we're not focusing on our comparative advantage. We're trying to produce things at home, even if it's more expensive. And so you're generating a loss for or inflationary effects for your consumers. Now, obviously, when I make this argument, people say, but you know, we are making it more expensive right now in the short term, but then our subsidies will allow production to happen at home. And as production happens at home, we have innovation, we have scale. And so eventually prices are going to go faster or going to go faster down. And so this is only a short-term blip for the consumer. It's not going to matter for the long term. Yes, but there are, again, a fragmentation of world order and of trade sort of goes in opposite directions. And the use of industrial policy at scale sort of generates effects in opposite directions. On the one side, we're seeing increased protectionism, increased reticence in sharing know-how, which again makes sense. You're investing big money to make sure that you have electric batteries produced in the US, and you have cutting edge technology produced in the US. You don't want this knowledge to then go somewhere else. And so you want to sort of fence that knowledge. But in doing that, you're reducing the interactions among scientists, you're hampering global science to a certain extent, and therefore you're slowing down the pace of innovation, including for your own scientists at home. On the other side, you could claim, look, the greatest leaps in innovation have been the result of large investments during Cold War period, during war periods. You can think of the Apollo project, which is a classic example that gets made by Marianna Mazzucato and others, to say this was a huge investment in innovation, and it happened only because of the Cold War. It would have been impossible in a non-Cold War scenario. And so if rising geopolitical tensions mean that we're investing more in innovation at home, this is what matters the most, and we're losing interaction among global scientists, but this will matter less. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but this is a chart from the World Bank report that shows exactly this, which is how much deglobalization matters, how much deglobalization will impact the world, or we generate losses to world GDP, has huge matters. It matters what are your assumptions on innovation. And this is, if you look at the last bar where it says full technological decoupling, this is what you're seeing, that you're having a huge loss for global GDP if we're assuming that there is a slowdown in innovation, because you have a complete separation in blocks between the Chinese bloc, the US bloc, potentially other blocks in a multipolar world. And so trade fragmentation might matter very little, or it might matter a lot, and the crucial aspect is how it impacts innovation. Innovation and competition, I am looking at the time as well. When we talk about innovation in the industrial policy, especially in Europe, what I hear a lot of is, look, we need large European companies. You need to loosen competition policy so that we can create European champions, so that they compete with the General Electrics of this world, they compete with the BYDs of this world, and so on. And so that if we don't create scale, we are not able to compete on global markets. And so you have to loosen competition policy in order to reinforce your industrial policy to a certain extent and generate these large domestic companies. Now, I have been arguing against this in the sense that you want to ensure innovation, as we saw, that is a crucial element. You want to keep down prices as much as possible because of the inflationary effect that your industrial policy is already having. And so you want to try to keep your competition policy active. You want to, let's say, enforce and promote competition that generates innovation at home, rather than loosen competition to artificially, for the short term, create these large companies that will, however, be less innovative for the longer term, and so weigh on your long-term prosperity for the longer term. Now, to the policy implications, as we have only 3 minutes. Policy implication number one. I don't want to get across, I've used 3 slides to say that industrial policy is good, 25 slides to say industrial policy is bad. So let me reiterate the point. I think that industrial policies should not be discouraged. It's what we have to use in a second best world, but the world is second best at best, as they say. And so is what we have and what we need to use. And for the US, this is particularly true. The US has tried to do carbon pricing for 20 plus years. It hasn't managed to do it at federal level, at least. And then with the Inflation Reduction Act, it has managed to go big on climate through industrial policy. If this is the way in which the US can only do it, so be it. And I think it's still better than nothing. And so I am willing to argue that it was a good thing that the Inflation Reduction Act passed, you can also make the point that, you know, this is for the benefit of the wider world. That if you're slowing down climate change, this is for the benefit of the wider world, and in particular of poorer nations. These are countries that, because of location and because of access to finance and because of lower income, are the ones that we know are going to be affected the most and the quickest by climate change. And so everything you do that as a developed country that you do in trying to accelerate the green transition is to the benefit of, also to the benefit of emerging markets or developing nations or countries in sub-Saharan Africa. However, those benefits are very indirect. So, you know, we can model them, we can show them on a chart, but this is not something that will, something that will go missed in international negotiations. And what instead countries will see is that you're using big money to repatriate production or bring back manufacturing to home, to the US, to Europe. And so this is what is going to be evident, and the long-term benefits are indirect and they're not going to be evident in international negotiations. I think that policymakers, especially in richer countries that are using industrial policy at scale, should be aware of this and discuss about this. And again, this is something that we haven't seen so much. We have definitely not seen it in the US when the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. It wasn't even, you know, again, I've seen it from the European perspective when we were extremely concerned of what this would do to green manufacturing in Europe. We came to the US and said, what are you doing with the Inflation Reduction Act? You have all of these domestic content requirements. And, you know, didn't you think about it for Europe? And the answer was no. It was August, we were in the 11th hour, we had to pass something quickly. We didn't think, we thought about finding a majority to pass this in Congress. It's not that we were going to think about the side effects on other parts of the world. So it didn't happen in the US, it didn't happen in Europe. The knee-jerk reaction in Europe was, we need our own tool, industrial policy tool, and the impact this would have on third countries has been limited. I think we should think carefully of innovation, as I was telling you, and what these industrial policy tools will do to innovation, what they will do, and what this increased protectionism will do to scientific cooperation and potentially immigration policies as well. And so that you want to, as much as possible, to safeguard scientific cooperation and to keep migration policies loose for scientists, for researchers, for workers in high-tech industries. Make sure that you're not hampering innovation, because if not, you're having a short-term benefit, but with large long-term costs. On the international dimension, one word again, one of the arguments, of course, that is used is the geopolitical argument. We saw it at the beginning in the definitions as to why you might want to use industrial policy. That argument is weak when you're thinking of allies, when you're thinking of like-minded nations. And so at the very least, you would expect that countries, whether it is Europe, the European Union, whether it is the US and others, can think of exemptions for countries that are close allies, to make sure that, you know, you're not generating some detrimental effects for allies, and that you're moving in the direction of something that is closer to nearshoring rather than reshoring. Again, this might be something that we will see also in the US for what concerns Mexico, and for Europe for what concerns Northern Africa. But it's something that you should keep in mind when thinking about industrial policy, that, you know, it should generate at the very least some degree of friend-shoring rather than reshoring. You know, on this again, you might want to use as much as possible climate finance to offset some of these negative effects. And so to say, look, I'm using industrial policy at home because this is the way in which I am accelerating the green transition at home. This has some detrimental effects, but I am helping countries that are going to be negatively affected with finance, in financing green projects, in financing green production, in helping decarbonize, in helping climate adaptation, and so on. Again, you can use, you can bring in geopolitics and say we're doing this with like-minded countries. We're seeing some examples of that with JETPs and other tools. So this is doable, and we should see more of this if you have in mind what the heavy use of industrial policy is doing at home. And that is that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much. I think we'll open it up for questions now. If you do have a question, just raise your hand and I'll give you the ability to speak.
We have 2 questions already in the Q&A box. So,
oh, thanks for catching that. Okay, why don't we start with, you can read them and then we'll turn it over.
I think developed countries should be taking responsibility for global impact like climate change, as they are the ones mostly contributing to global climate change. Also frame more. Yes, so I am all for it. I'm all, there is the moral argument. This is particularly strong in Europe. I don't know how strong it is in the US, assuming the question comes from a US participant. But in Europe, it is extremely strong, this idea of saying, look, if you look at historical emissions, we've created this mess. Some countries in Europe have contributed enormously to this, and so we need to fix it. In my line of thinking, politically, this is not going to take us very far. So I'm all for it. I agree with this argument. And I think that it works in certain environments, in certain groups, but that on its own, this is not going to prod nations to alter completely their production structure or to put multi-billion packages on the table. And so what I make as an argument there is a more self-interested argument, which goes hand in hand with the previous one. So they're not necessarily at odds, but it is to say, look, developed countries have a responsibility, but it is also in their interest to try and be at the frontier of technologies of the future. And if you don't, you're going to be stuck in technologies that are going to be very quickly perceived as old, as lower quality, as lower value. And then you're not going to get growth, you're not going to get jobs. So it is in the interest of your long-term prosperity, and it is also your responsibility. So the 2 arguments go hand in hand, and I think they can reinforce each other. I see you're not a fan of Jason Hickel. Can you explain more about your criticism of degrowth's treatment of the Global South or the harmful outcomes? I quite like the 2024 paper, how much growth is required to achieve good lives for all. I mean, it's not an easy question in the sense that indeed I've devoted a good chunk of my recent professional life looking at the details of degrowth, of the degrowth perspective as to how we should fight climate change, and whether this is helpful or feasible. And I guess to link it to my previous answer, a big chunk of the degrowth argument is to say, look, the rich countries are rich, they already have enough, and actually have more than enough. And so we should shrink the economies of rich countries and transfer resources to poorer nations. And because they still need to grow, and they still, obviously, they're developing countries, they're very poor countries, so they need to grow. Rich nations don't need to grow. And in the process, so we're shrinking the economy of the rich ones, and so we will be lowering emissions in the process as well. This argument doesn't quite work. I wrote a little piece with Gernot Wagner, which I saw, not only he's an alumnus of EDF, but he also came to one of your seminars I saw. And in the argument, we were trying to do the basic arithmetics of this point, which is to say, look, if you're trying to achieve decarbonization by shrinking the economy of rich countries, you're not going to go very fast. And you could see this even by simply looking at the fact that rich nations, and which rich, let's say we look at G7 countries, or Europe and the US, or Europe, the US and Japan, are responsible for something like 40% of emissions. Even if you look at the whole OECD, let's say, the developed countries are responsible for something like 40% of emissions, which means that if we were to wipe out completely the economies of rich nations, we would still have 60% of emissions that we have to take care of. And so that the argument that you can, just redistribute resources and in the process you're going to fight climate change doesn't quite work. And from a political economy perspective of richer nations, this is a non-starter. We are seeing fights over green transition policies, even when they impact the slightest element. So, we ban plastic straws, which is the tiniest of things. Why do you even need a straw unless you have some sort of problem drinking? And yet this is already generating an uproar. Imagine if I were to tell you, well, actually we have to shrink your income, average income, by 40, 50, 60%. Because this is in the interest of another nation. This is not going to fly. So from a political dimension, political economy dimension, I also don't think is a conversation starter, or is going to get us very far from climate policy dimension.
Let's switch to some live questions now. I'm going to allow Wong to talk because she had her hand raised.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks, Alessio, for your presentation, which is packed of great information. I see that you made a strong argument for green industrial policy. And my question is more about the practicality of green industrial policy in Europe, because a lot of these, policy related to subsidies and tax credits, as well as choosing the winners, choosing the industry to subsidize, are at the member state level, right? So it's Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands will have many different ideas about how to do this. So how does this, green industrial policy at the EU level is actually realized? It would be great to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
I thought I was abandoning Brussels, a Brussels crowd but I'm glad I find deep knowledge of EU issues. Also,
I'm actually based in the Netherlands.
I should have said, if you have a question, maybe introduce yourself and say your affiliation. Wong is at EDF and very EU focused.
Yes.
Then if you're EU focused and based in the Netherlands, you know that the issue is simple, which has huge complexities. But the issue originates from the fact that first, I told you during the presentation that industrial policy requires big money. It requires multi-billion packages, and the EU as an entity does not have that money. And so we're having to, we were doing industrial policy in the past, mainly through white papers, a bit like EDF. We were writing papers saying, we have a strategy, these are the things we should be doing, but we don't have much money to do it. And so we weren't doing that much in the past. Once we got more serious about it, we realized we needed more firepower, financial firepower, and the financial firepower is to be found in the national government's budget. And so again, there was a Faustian pact at EU level this time around, because what we did is to say, you know what, we allow you national governments to use the money you have in order to do this industrial policy. And so we are loosening state aid provisions to allow you to do that. And we are seeing exactly the same problem that I was telling you about at the global level, at the European level. Because obviously, who is going to be able to do this is big countries. Who is able to go to Microsoft, if we're looking at the chips dimension, and say, I'm going to give you 5 billion to set up one fab in my country. It's not Malta. It's not Greece. It's not Portugal. It is Germany. It is France. It is Italy. It is countries that are bigger, richer, that are able to use more resources to attract manufacturing or to use industrial policy tools and state aid at large scale. And of course, one could make the argument that it's still an improvement because you are reshoring or at least nearshoring some of this production, and having chip production in France is still better than having it in Taiwan, which is dangerous from a geopolitical perspective. So there are positive arguments to be made, but again, this generates very toxic politics within Europe as well, and it is not contributing to even development of the European Union. And so this is the negative dimension of it.
Okay, how about Dave?
Thank you so much. So I'm Dave McLaughlin. I'm a senior economist here at EDF. It's great to meet you. Thank you so much for the presentation. And I don't work in this area, so I'm going to ask you a very naive question and try to relate it to what I am familiar with. So I am familiar with avoiding emissions from avoiding deforestation. And you're mentioning that a structural transition. Oh, I can come off? Oh, I was going to show you my face too, but I can't. I guess I can't. So I'm still hiding. You talked to that, like, we want to avoid getting in the way of structural transformation, right? With policy. And I think it's the same. Do you think that there are opportunities to do this in developing countries where there are, where we could create an outside option from like deforestation, like where there could be a green industrial policy for developing countries? I mean, I know you said it takes multi-billion dollars and you're often doing it domestically, but are there opportunities? I mean, this is a lot of money. So are there also opportunities in developing countries, I guess is the question, because giving them another choice instead of, having an economy that relies on cattle, like raising cattle or soy, giving like the next step in their development would probably maybe do two things at once. So.
Absolutely. I talk in my work in general. My spiel is green growth. And so the argument that you're not having to choose between the economy and nature, but actually you can invest in the economy or a different type of production, and this will come to the benefit of nature, the planet, climate change, and creating jobs and growth. Now, when I give this talk to developing country settings, sometimes what I hear, the pushback I get is, look, your talk sounds nice, but this is something for richer nations. I cannot do this. I will focus first on development, and then later on, when I'm developed, I will focus on this green stuff. And I think that, I see where this argument is coming from. I think it's wrong. And I think that indeed, as you are suggesting, developing countries can and should focus already on green technologies now and catch the green train now, where there are huge growth opportunities. Some of these industries are growing at double-digit rate or exponential trends, whether we're looking at EVs, whether we're looking at batteries, whether we're looking at hydrogen production, whether we're looking at electrolyzers and so on. There's a variety of these things, that is wind, solar, that is growing extremely fast. And so if you can latch on to one element within the supply chain, which can be at a very basic level of the supply chain or a more advanced level of the green supply chain, this is good for growth, is good for development, and is good for the environment. And of course, there are policies that developed countries can use to try and help developing countries do that. because of course, often the problem is not even, to realize that this is a possibility, is to have the access to finance to make these things happen. And there is a lot that can happen in this respect. There is, of course, the public sector dimension, which goes through foreign aid or climate-related aid. And we were talking about some of it earlier. There is something that the private sector can do. I'm thinking of carbon credits and things like this. But I think that the greatest push will come from the fact that many of these investment projects are investment projects. And so they're an investment opportunity. And so countries and companies will come in and build hydrogen production plants in parts of Africa because electricity is cheaply available there, and hydrogen can be sold, and this is an investment opportunity. And this is where I think huge investment will be unleashed, rather than through aid and through public support and public money. Again, it doesn't mean that one excludes the other, but the largest chunk will come from private finance, I think, when and as soon as these become investment opportunities.
Thank you so much.
I wanted to jump really quickly. I know we are about to finish, but I know of your work and on the Green Complexity Atlas and so on. So I wanted to talk a little bit, that you talk a little bit more of how to choose these opportunities. And probably we don't have a lot of time, but in some sense, the fact that you say like take a component of the value chain or so on. I mean, like small countries could take advantage of that and develop their industries to be part of this transition and so on. So in some sense, how to choose those, and I mean, especially for these countries, how they identify them.
To a certain extent, I suspect you're asking me a question that in part you know the answer to, and the other part is very hard to know an answer to, in the sense that I'm not Ricardo Hausmann, first thing, and second, I'm not the wizard, so I don't know the future. What the Atlas can do and help you, and what the key and underlying principle of the Atlas is to say, look, don't try to start making advanced electrolyzers from nothing. Try to understand what you're doing already and what you can build on, what is close to what you're doing that can go in that direction. And some of these transformations often are simpler than we think, or closer to what you're doing than you think. And maybe, you're doing mining, and perhaps the switching from coal mining to nickel mining is easier than, even though they sound like completely different things, one in the real, polluting sector and the other contributing to the green transition. But that is a doable switch, perhaps. And then from that, I'm looking at Indonesia as an example. You say, okay, I'm mining a lot of the nickel. Perhaps processing some of it is not completely outside of the sphere of possibilities. And then you start processing some of it. And once you start processing some of it, you say, okay, you know what? Batteries and attracting FDI to produce batteries is not that far from what we're already doing. And you sort of build along the ladder of production along these lines. I'm picking an example that is easy because they're doing it well and it's working well for them. There are a lot of examples where it's not as easy and it's not working as well. But I think that is the underlying understanding of where the Atlas and the Green Atlas could work.
Okay, so I think we're at time, so we will call it there. Thanks so much for this very interesting talk.
Thank you, and have a nice day.
Have a nice night.
Goodbye.